I will.
Thank you for lunch.
Hey everybody. Thanks for coming out to support your local independent bookstore. Your attendance and book purchases let us have events like this, and we really appreciate it. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from Lindsay Starck as she presents Monsters We Have Made with Daniel Wallace. Lindsay Starck is a writer, editor, and professor based in Minneapolis. She studied at Yale, Notre Dame, and UNC Chapel Hill. Her first novel, Noah's Wife, was published in 2016. When she's not typing on her laptop or taking pictures of it, she's traveling with her husband or training their dog, Cedar. Daniel Wallace is the author of 6 novels, including Big Fish, which was adapted and released as a movie and Broadway musical. He is the J. Ross McDonald Distinguished Professor of English at UNC Chapel Hill. All right, thank you again. If you haven't gotten a copy of Monsters We Have Made or Daniel's This Isn't Going to End Well, you can grab those up front after the reading. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to be finally with you, Lindsay, who we met for the first time when? I'm going to plug this question. Like,
yeah, no.
Surprise question.
I remember. Can you all hear me? Should I use
can
the
you hear
microphone?
can you hear without the thing?
It's okay? Yeah. It's an intimate.
Yeah, it feels good. It feels okay?
Yeah. If it's streaming, then you might have
Oh,
to.
yeah, the streaming.
I don't, there's a thing.
It's not live streaming, it's just going to be recorded, but you can do whatever you want.
Oh, it's not live streaming.
Okay.
So we're not live.
This will be cut out of the final version? Okay.
Yeah, your voice is good.
Okay.
It carries because you're a professor.
That's true.
You know how
I
to
profess.
do that.
Yeah. Okay, so we met because I was working on the Carolina Quarterly, and I was asking you, I don't know, some question about the Quarterly, but also Noah's Wife was coming out. And I thought, oh my goodness, wouldn't it be amazing if Daniel Wallace read and blurbed Noah's Wife? But I was too afraid to ask him. So we had lunch, and I mentioned the novel was coming out, and then Daniel just said, do you want me to read and blurb it? Yes. It was amazing. And then I wanted to apply for jobs in creative writing, and I said, well, the hard thing is that I have never actually taught creative writing, so I'm not super hireable. And Daniel said, well, I'll just give you a creative writing class. And so my first grade, I have a job because Daniel gave me a class.
Yes, that's the only reason.
And then when we've stayed in touch, of course, over the years. And then when I was coming down here, I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if Daniel were in conversation with me at the bookstore? But no, everyone asks him. I can't do it. I can't ask him. It's just too much. And then I sent a note to say I would be here, and he said, well, do you want me to be in conversation with you? And I was like, basically reading my mind, so yes.
But that makes me feel, seem like a different sort of person than I project myself as being. Lindsay is probably going, oh my God, he wants to be in conversation with me. What do I say? I guess I have to say yes. You might have had somebody else you wanted to be in conversation with.
Nope.
And I just insinuated myself. And then the whole thing about blurbing the book, that's also something I insinuated myself. It's like, I've got enough. She's thinking, God, I've got like 18 blurbs. What am I going to do with them? But then, I look at the book and I see that my blurb is third.
I didn't have any control over that, for the record. It's on microphone. Yeah.
And I just did notice this, that it was third, and it's kind of changed the tone of how this conversation goes.
Fair, yeah.
Noah's Wife, his first book. I think it's important to bring it up in context with this, because they're both great books. They're both, in many ways, different. They're the same in that they're both exquisitely written, and the sentences, or every sentence is worth reading. There's none that you want to skip over, but tonally, they're a little different, right? How would you describe Noah's Wife, if you remember it? I know it was years ago.
It has been a while, yeah. Well, Noah's Wife, has a more whimsical, fairy tale, fable-esque feel. I was learning to write. It was my kind of grad school novel, and I like to describe the first draft as a lot of charming characters standing around talking to each other in the rain, which was great. And then my editor was like, "There's no plot here," And I was like, I know, you're welcome. It's just too charming for plot. She was like, yeah, no. So then I had to kind of learn to write plot and make things happen in Noah's Wife, and I did. And then when it came out, and I think Monsters suffers a little bit from this too, it's not super easy to categorize in terms of genre, and Noah's Wife also isn't. And it struggled because it fell into Amazon categories of historical fiction and Christian fiction, neither of which it is. But reviews and readers, it's kind of all about expectations. And my editor told me recently, you know, a negative book review usually isn't about the book itself. It's about a person saying, I thought this book was going to be this, and now it's not, and getting upset about that. So I thought, well, I'm going to write my next book, and no one's going to be able to call it historical fiction or Christian fiction. And so I wrote about Slenderman. But yeah, and so I think the interest in language is certainly still there. Thank you for pointing that out. But I wanted to write a story that was a little bit more propulsive and really moved in different ways.
Right, and that's remarkable that you felt like, well, initially you didn't have any real control or interest in plot, because this is plotted. I mean, it's suspenseful, and for a suspenseful story, it has to be pretty meticulously plotted.
Yeah, and it took a while, 7 or 8 years by various counts. And I think the first act was always suspenseful for whatever reason. It's kind of full of these sort of found documents, they're figuring out the crime, the pace has always moved. The second half, acts 2 and 3, have always fallen off. In the first round of rejections I got from various houses, people were like, I was with it with the first half, and then no. And I think in the second round they said similar things, but it was nice because they all said the same thing. And so I knew that I just had to figure out how to make the second half move the way the first did. And we touched on this a little, but one of the challenges near the end of the writing process was rewriting the ending. I might just jump there. So Act 3, if you read it, it's pretty brand new. A week before the final manuscript was due to my editor, I realized the final 90 pages were all wrong. And so I just wrote her an email. I was like, hey, Caitlin, I'm gonna need a month and it'll be different. Okay, bye. And signed off and then went to the Northwoods. The final act of the novel takes place along the North Shore of Minnesota, along Lake Superior. And I thought I need to go there and be there and see it and see where the monster is. And so I put my dog Cedar in the car and we drove up and we stayed a couple nights in a B&B near the lake and walked around and looked at the trees and looked at the water, and that kind of all made it into that final third. But I was thinking about Frankenstein, actually, which I was just talking about with my friend Perry the other night. And Frankenstein, the end of it is just this kind of pursuing the monster across the frozen tundra. And my original Act 3, my character Sylvia starts to go toward the Northwoods, and then something calls her back to the city. And so she turns the car around and goes back to Minneapolis. Oh. And I thought, just if you visualize the shape of that, that's all wrong. That's not plot, right? Like, she was on her way, the arrow was headed toward the end, and then I just turned the car around. And so in this version, she keeps going.
Sure. Very important. Well, that's wonderful, because everything about this story, well, it's a story about stories. And when you're a writer writing a story, it's a story about storytelling, or a story about stories. Everything is getting more meta out all the time. But let's just tell everyone of what this book is in 50 words or less.
Well, it's inspired by a true crime, but swerves away from that true crime because
it's fiction.
It's fiction. And so it's a novel that explores what happens to a family when the unimaginable happens. And 13 years after this crime was committed, where is the family now? A mother goes in search of her daughter who's gone missing, who committed this crime. She's also in search of the monster who inspired her daughter to commit this crime. And as she sort of propels herself along this quest of discovery. She has to face the relationship she fractured and the guilt she buried and the stories she didn't want to examine.
That's more than 50 words. Okay. So it was, you said, inspired by a true crime. So it's another level to this story, which is a so-called true story, something that actually happened, that was inspired by an online website called,
The website was called Creepypasta, where he first appeared. The monster was Slender Man.
Slender Man, right. And Slender Man, what were the characteristics of Slender Man?
Slender Man. He always wears a suit. He's got just kind of a white circle instead of a face, many tentacled arms, and he's often in the woods. He first appeared in photoshopped images that were created by a second grade teacher named Eric Knudsen, who lives in Florida, and they took off. And the images are kind of these found footage. They're sort of, images of children at a library or children on a playground, and then in the back is Slender Man. And I think it was a combination of the image, and then there were these captions under the image that did something like, the town library burned down, and this is all that remains, and no one has heard from these children since, or whatever. And so,
Right.
So it was very creepy, and the internet totally went for it, and YouTube series were created, other images were created. And it's really interesting because I read a scholar of oral folklore talking about Slender Man who said, the thing about oral folklore is you can't pinpoint when it began. But Slender Man you can, right? There's this moment, and then suddenly you can just watch the way it proliferates and the paths it takes and how he shifts and moves over time and how the story changes. So that's really interesting. And then he found his way to the computer of these two girls outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they committed a crime.
Right. And it's fascinating, but not everybody who is fascinated by that writes a book inspired by it. Why was it so engaging for you that it was the seed? Or was that the seed for the book?
I think it was the seed, but I also think the seed was a book I read when I was in middle school called Susan Cooper's The Boggart. I don't know if anyone here has read it.
The what?
The Boggart.
No.
And it's the story, it's a middle grade novel, but it's about these two kids in Scotland who find who accidentally unleash through their computer, a much older style computer, an ancient Scottish kind of trickster figure, the Boggart. And then they have to spend the novel getting him back on the internet. And I thought this was great. And so I think there was always something there about ancient things being unleashed in new ways, and I think more specifically something about how fictions kind of come off the page and into the world, and the fact that a true crime was inspired by a fictional monster. In what ways, and this is something the novel grapples with, in what ways does that crime then make the monster real, right? Does it matter if the monster isn't real, if the crime is real, and he was the cause of the crime? How can you be the cause of something if you're not real? So I think those questions of belief and fiction and dream and reality were all kind of tangled up together.
Right. It's this novel and reviews and from this reader, you find it both really suspenseful and at the same time literary. And I think we understand what suspenseful is. I don't know that we understand as well what literary really is. What do you think that means?
I think literature, as opposed to non-literature, and I'm sure we'll quibble over what books go where, asks big questions. There's more to the story than the story, right? There's just so many layers. And one of my favorite kind of writerly quotes is from Chekhov, who says that the role of the artist is not to answer questions, but to pose questions correctly. And so I think it's books that raise these questions, that point to these larger issues, themes, ideas. So I wanted the novel to do that. Interest in language, too. I don't know, do you have a definition of literary?
I try to avoid that. I don't know that I do have one. I do find that the only coherent definition I have are the books that sell the worst. Are literally books, suspense. But maybe with the suspense, you can sort of, focus on the suspense and make the literary less so, and you'll sell more books.
Yep.
An idea. So that's really what is the thing that I love about this book, is that you are engaged in this story in a very real way, and so much so that, and then that I emailed you about this as I was reading the book. There's the Kingman, and is the Slender Man in the book. Is Kingman is the name of it, and his presence is like very shadowy. You never really see him, but you think you see him, and you think you see him in the trees and shadows, and he just is able to take these forms. And many characters in the book, not just the kids who perform, who feel like they're more liable to fall into this idea, but the parents too see Kingman. And I also started to see Kingman out of the corner of my eye, which is where monsters exist, right? Just in the corner of your eye. And it's the way it's described in the book, just this flash and it's gone. And you only can see him if you're not looking at him. Once you really look, you can't see him. But I was trying to get to the place where I wanted you to read from the book. Yeah, and this is that place.
Well, what you said made me think of, I think it made it into this draft. It's hard to remember what was cut. But there's this field I didn't know about called psychophysics, in which one of the things that is studied is human perception and the moment at which you stop perceiving something that's still there. So, for example, I'll play a bell in this room and ask you if you hear it, and then I'll play it softer and softer and softer, and then you'll tell me the moment when you can no longer hear it. And we both know it's still ringing, you just can't hear it anymore, right? So there's like a line at which there's something there, you're just not perceiving it. Or the difference between two shades of blue, I think is the other example that was in the novel at one point. And so there's a difference there, but at some point you just can't perceive it. And so I think the limits of perception are really interesting, and the way that fiction can kind of expand those limits at certain moments and have you doubt your limits at other moments is something.
So,
shall I read?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Is there anything in particular? Or?
Well, that very first, just you get right into this the world that you take us to begins at the very first page. So.
Yes. Yes. The one thing I want to say two things about this opening. First, thanks to a pal of mine who told me a childhood story that inspired it. So, thanks, Katie. And we can talk more about that later. And also, one of the things I've learned over the past couple of years writing this novel and teaching fiction and reading more fiction is the importance of, to make a plot move, we talk about in our fiction writing classes, a combination of desire and fear. And so I wanted this opening to have this sense of desire and fear, and there's a lot of fear in the novel. And here you get Sylvia, the protagonist, her opening, kind of what she wants and what she fears and how those things are tied up together and what comes next. So if you want to follow along, it's page 5. But you don't have to. Oh, and I was picturing Wilmington, but it's not named. I grew up in a house of disappearing children. I want you to know this. I need you to see how the infants spun through my world like carousel horses, fretful and untamed. For 13 days, they would squall in their cradles and coo in my mother's arms. And on the 14th day, the caseworker would click through the front door on her scuffed black pumps, sling the baby across the padded shoulder of her blazer, and crunch back down the crushed shell driveway to her car. My mother and I would watch from behind the screened windows of the porch, the sea breeze ribboning through our limp hair, our elbows hoisted in a paltry imitation of a wave. The gulls pinwheeled overhead, and I imagined that I heard in their high-pitched, anguished cries an echo of the emotions that I did not yet have the words to express. The next month, a new infant would be swaddled and delivered to our door, and the carousel would careen around again. I've tried to remember how the situation was first explained to me. Was it my sister who described the sterile hallways of a distant hospital, the nurses scuttling around a woman who was writhing on a white bed, straining to bring a baby into that fluorescent-lit room? While I didn't know what it meant to be in labor, somehow I came to understand that the infants who flitted through our lives possessed not one mother, but two. In addition to the woman on the white bed, there was another shadow figure, lingering somewhere nearby, waiting to spirit that child away. It would be a long time before I learned about adoption laws, the transferal of parental rights, and the revocation of consent. Back then, between the ages of 6 and 9, all I knew was that I adored those strangers' babies. I spent hundreds of hours combing their bald heads and humming fragments of invented lullabies, and when I ran out of those, rattling off the names of all the seashells I could recall. Coquinas, augurs, olives, whelks. I celebrated whenever a new infant arrived, and I sobbed each time one of them left us, and I swore that when I was finally old enough to have a baby of my own, I'd never, ever let her go.
That's lovely. And it's so ominous. It's beautiful and ominous at the same time. It is, and especially, it's the language that you use and the syntax. And it's almost kind of this, I don't know, I'm not good at dating literature, but I feel like I wanted to ask you about your models, but like something like Rebecca, where there's this doubt, there's this haziness, there's this questioning that's always happening. And of course, having babies come and go, that's always, if you want something ominous and foreboding to happen, that's a really good way to go about it. But what are some of your models, if there were any, for this book?
Yeah, certainly the Gothic genre, which is so focused on the house. In here, the house is also important, but it's so much in Sylvia's memories. I did a lot of research on monsters and fairy tales, certainly fairy tales, the Grimm brothers, who are super dark. And then, I read a lot about changelings. We're talking about kind of, babies being spirited away, and this idea that was once very strong, that if you had a baby and your baby seemed different somehow, that perhaps your baby wasn't your baby but had been placed there in exchange for something. And it just got me thinking a lot about monsters, and monsters as kind of manifestations of our cultural fears and anxieties, and the fact that we create these monsters because we are afraid of things, as Sylvia is afraid of things, and if you have a fear that you can't kind of vanquish or grapple with or really battle at all, but you put it in a monster form, suddenly there's something there that you can fight. And so I think that I'm sort of veering away from the inspiration question to talk about monsters. But all of it was fun doing a lot of monster research. I watched a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That was really great.
That's the perfect research.
I know, research.
I want to write a monster book now. Go back and watch all of Buffy again.
They're great. Lots of little clips on YouTube when you're doing other things. Definitely the Grimm brothers. Frankenstein, Susan Cooper, the Earl King, the ancient German. I don't want to say too much about it because there are real German scholars in the room. But one of the things that, the thing about the poem The Earl King too is there's this father riding home, and he's got his son on a horse with him, and his son says, I see something there. And the father says, no, it's just the light in the willows or whatever. And I hear something there. No, it's just the wind in the trees. And then the father arrives at his destination, and the child is dead on the horse. And just this, I wish it had a better ending, but.
Do you really?
But again, this idea that like maybe the son sees something the father doesn't see, and as adults we get used to kind of explaining away things that are uncanny or unlikely or impossible. And yeah, that line between childhood and adulthood, the novel really kind of deals with that as well. Whereas the line between play violence and real violence, and once you've crossed it, there's no going back. But you can play at shooting games, and then suddenly there can be a shooting. So.
Right. And I think going back to your definition of literature, and the book succeeds so well on that level in which it's so much a book about family and love and forgiveness, and that to me is not a real hook for a book. I would be as drawn to a book about, if somebody were hand selling me a book about family and love and forgiveness, I don't know that I would. But and a monster, yes, please. That you are able to explore all these different ideas which are somehow connected through in this outfit sort of this monster, which is the creation of the internet, of a person, also your creation, right? It's not the same monster, it's a different one which you have promulgated here, which in its own way could potentially have its own sort of power all of its own. It could be the beginning of a whole new monster.
I know.
Yeah.
You can see it started right here.
Right here.
Yeah. The people on YouTube are
It's
listening.
just a book. No?
There's no monster.
Yeah, there's the monster. Kids.
Yeah. For some reason, I don't know why, but that's making me think of when I was working on a draft of the book a couple summers ago. I was at an artist residency in Wyoming with some visual artists, and one of the visual artists was a printmaker. And we were sitting at dinner talking, and she mentioned something about how when you're making a print, a woodblock or whatever, I can't remember how she put it, but it's something like, what you don't carve is what ends up on the page, or like what you do carve is the thing that you don't see, right? And that kind of, that absent, that just was really striking to me, and this idea that, yeah, all of the things that are beyond the borders, all the things that we think we control but sort of seep in anyway. And so that's why the girls use a woodcutting knife, a printmaking knife,
Oh,
to
really?
do their crime. Yeah.
So that's how that got in there.
That's how that got in there. Yeah.
Wow. So the process, that's interesting because that does speak to the process of creating and writing books. How does this happen? And it's so often, it is these little chance events that it's almost like an Easter egg. Like nobody knows that, right? And nobody would really care to know it, but knowing it deepens the book just because it's your experience as a part of it. How we both took about the same amount of time on our most recent books. How did yours, the process of working on a book for that long is different than working on a book for, say, 3 years. It's just significantly different. How was it for you to write it, and what was the process of, everybody goes through the process of showing it to people, editors, and everything changes because of that. But I'm sure over 7 years there was a lot of differences.
Yeah, there were a lot of differences. The first version of the novel was told from a totally different perspective. Right now there's kind of Sylvia, there's Faye, who is this young girl who committed this crime and then grows up, and she's the heart of it, and the story is narrated by her mother, Sylvia. And Faye also has a daughter who in this novel is about 4 years old. But the original version, more time had passed. Faye's daughter, Amelia, was all grown up, and she was the one narrating. And so it was still a story about this kind of missing person at the heart, Faye, but it was kind of this daughter's quest to find her mother instead of this mother's quest to find her daughter. And at some point, and I remember being on the phone with my agent and saying, I don't think it's this daughter's story. I think it has to be the mother looking, because in both cases you have a quest narrative, but it's so much more interesting if the mother is the one questing, because then you have all of this like guilt and responsibility and complicated love layered on top that the daughter wouldn't necessarily have. My agent was like, no, I don't think that's it. And I was like, no. Everyone has rejected it, so we're gonna try it. So we did that. So I think part of the process for me, more so here than in Noah's Wife, was learning to trust my instinct, which isn't always right, but in that case. And then when I told my husband, who's not here, so I can throw him under the bus, but when I said, the final 90 pages aren't right, I'm going to redo it, he was like, it's great, they already bought it. Obviously they like it. And I was like, but they don't know how it could be, right? I think that's the challenge too with finishing a novel and having it be done in the world is, I just stopped working on it.
Right.
It's not actually finished. And I don't know how you feel about your book, whether by the time you were done, having thought about it for so long. But yeah, how did it feel to
Every word is perfect.
Buy it for sale.
No, you just have to stop before you really start to hate it, and don't want anybody to see it ever again. So it's so perfect, and revisiting older books is kind of hell, and because you do see, and ideally, you would put books away, you'd write them, think they're done, and put them away for a year. Put them in just to do something else for a year, write another book or something, and then come back to it. Yeah. And you'll definitely see how to make it better, and it will be better if you do that. But don't do that. Even after so many years, there could be more years. And you really do have to, I feel like, move on. Yeah. Some way. You'll never get it exactly right. Just less wrong. I'm going to open the floor up for questions, even though, and I know a lot of people have them. But last thing, talk about your mom for a second, because in the acknowledgements, she says that her mom reads every draft of her book. Every draft.
I'm an only child. I need to put that out there. That feels important. I don't seem like it. I'm very well adjusted, but yeah, only child. And yeah, my mom, Lorelai, who's great and was a librarian and a big reader. And yeah, when I was working on my first novel, Noah's Wife, I was in South Bend in a little apartment, and I had on my door 40 Post-it notes, one for each of the 40 chapters of the novel. And she at home had 40 Post-it notes on her door, so that when we talked on the phone about it, we could refer to the same thing.
That's awesome.
I mean, I always thought our relationship was healthy. Some might call it codependent a little bit. I mean, who's to say again where the line is? But yeah, and I think she's really important to this novel, in part because. And I know I startled you when I said this today, but I am not a mother. And it's a story from a mother's perspective, about a child who's done this terrible thing. And a friend of mine, when she finished it, she was surprised that it was from this perspective. And she said, well, did you talk to a lot of moms? And I was like, I mean, I do talk to a lot of moms. Right. And I actually did read a lot of memoirs, and I read in the early days a lot of kind of child rearing books, and my mom sent me one called How to Raise Good Children that she had used. So yeah, so I did a lot of reading, but also none of the moms I know, thank goodness, have been through this. And so I think, but there's so much. I want to say that even though it's a book about monsters, and there are some scary parts, and it's a mystery, and there's suspense, it's also very much a love story. And there's a love between Sylvia and Jack, but there's also this like really deep, abiding love that Sylvia, the mother, has for her daughter, Faye. And although I do not have a daughter, I feel in writing those scenes, kind of looking back, a lot of the things that Sylvia remembers about Faye, these images, I remember just being on the other end of them. So there's like a moment where they're in the kitchen baking a cake together, and Sylvia's remembering Faye sitting on the counter as they're beating the egg whites into foam. And I can remember like being Faye, right, sitting on that counter and being with my mother. And so I think the love that Sylvia just projects toward Faye, that's this kind of all complicated but all consuming, encompassing love, is a love that I felt always from my mother, and it's just flipped. Yeah.
But the idea that you have to even defend or explain yourself in this regard, I think, is unnecessary for any writer, either it works or it doesn't work. Either you tell the story the right way, either it's believable or it's not. And it is obviously totally believable. I mean, I didn't think for a second, and that was one reason I think that I just assumed.
I'm glad about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a little worried. I said to my editor at one point, I was like, do you think all of like the mean internet moms are gonna come for me because I'm not a mom? And she was like, I hope they do. Can you imagine? Like, we'd sell so many books.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. So.
Well, I know we haven't covered nearly, the book, it's just got so many things going on, but I know there are probably things that some of you guys want to know too that we haven't talked about. So ply her with questions. Angry internet moms. Oh, maybe there's some here tonight.
We organized.
Yeah.
I have a question about Faye as someone, by the time I finish the novel, I'll not do spoilers or anything, but she still felt very nebulous to me. So I was wondering how strong of a sense you have of Faye as a character. Like, do you know all of her motivations and what happens to her next and all of that? Or like, how did you keep her so shadowy for us?
Yeah, I don't think I do. I think the question of why would someone do this thing is just so, for me, unanswerable that I don't think I ever quite figured it out. And maybe that's why she had to remain sort of nebulous. And I think, too, so much of the novel is Sylvia asking those same questions. Who is this person I thought I knew, but I didn't know? And I think, that's one of the reasons why I really loved reading your memoir, which is also so much about being so close to a person you love and yet not knowing everything and trying so hard. And we're always trying so hard to understand and to see another person's life and inner self and motivations, but we'll just never get there. So I think that was sort of key to Faye as well. But there is a lot more Faye than there was in earlier drafts, and she was even more shadowy. So I think it's good that there's slightly.
I loved the sense of place that you were able to bring forth, like both in North Carolina and Minnesota. And like I was thinking as I was reading about how those are both places that you know. And I guess I'm just curious what your process of writing about places that you know well, but I'm guessing you also still had to do some kind of, I don't know, like research about like just the natural environments that you describe. It's so evocative, and I was like, how would I even like think to draw forth like these details, but they felt very resonant for the North Carolina parts for a place that I know. I'm just curious like what your process of writing about places you've lived was.
Thank you. That's great. Well, Emma actually wrote to me and said, "Did I see Linda's in there?" I was like, "You did actually." Yeah. So Linda's was definitely in there. So forever memorialized. But yeah. Someone said once about kind of doing research for fiction. I don't know who, I'm sure many people have said this, not just the one time, but that you do pages and pages and pages of research to get that one significant detail and hours just for that single image. And so I think being in the places was really important. I started the novel right after I left down here and came back a lot, so that was helpful. And then in Minnesota, especially that final section, kind of going up to the North Woods. I also think reading, I have this big, beautiful book called The North Shore, and I was reading, I only got it's 400 pages, I only got 15 pages in because I got what I needed from it, but one of the things I got was that, on the islands that are up in Lake Superior, before, people came and ripped them apart for copper mines, the moss was 3 feet deep beneath these old growth trees. And there were so many caterpillars that if you stood still, you could hear them munching. I know. And I underlined it and then forgot. Otherwise, I would have put that in. But so just like those details that when I'm reading about a place, they kind of strike me. And I'm like, oh, right. And then also in that book is where I learned that there was this island in Lake Superior that appeared on, it appeared on maps of Lake Superior, Isle of Philly-Poe, and in the 18th century, and then people went back looking for it and couldn't find it. And so was it a mirage? Was it a smudge? No one knows, but there was an island that was there and then vanished. and that's why it's a monstrous island. But I think, and when I'm writing short stories about places I haven't been, I read a lot of travel blogs and watch a lot of YouTube videos, or there's a scene in the novel where she's driving to Duluth, and even though I did that drive, I went on YouTube to and just search for video of someone driving into Duluth, and that was helpful. So yeah, the more you can see and hear and feel, and then a lot got cut out. So yeah.
Are you?
Yes.
I have a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my limited experience with writing creatively is a different type of writing that's like, more like song, and it's very personal, and so I'm like really struggling to understand what it must be like to write something and then somebody just like reject it. Can you tell, but you're saying you cut things, but other people also, sounds like, told you things that they thought you should cut. So like, how do you preserve the part of it that feels like authentically your creative energy while responding to feedback that probably has made it like the best it can be, but without sort of like falling apart?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Really good.
Yeah, and you have an answer as well. Well, I think I always fall apart a little bit. So first, it's like I want the feedback, and then it comes, and then the blow is crushing. And certainly with the first novel, every time I got an editorial letter from my editor, I would just lay down on the floor and sob and claim that I was never doing it again. And then after an hour, you get up and you're like, okay, I guess I'll do it. I'll try again. So I've definitely gotten more accustomed to rejection.
Really?
Yes. And it's kind of nice. The way my agent sends rejections is actually really nice because she sends them as they come in. So I get a few rejections every day or two. My husband recently submitted a different project, a history book, to publishers, and the agent he was working with at the very end sent him a 3-page single-spaced document of all of the reasons why people weren't taking it, all at once.
Oh.
He didn't work on it for a year. It was very crushing. But yeah, so I think you kind of get used to it. And then I think it was helpful when the rejections came in that so many people were saying the same thing. And I was like, okay, if this many people are believing that the ending falls flat, then maybe it's not working. So that I was lucky that way. But I think one of the things we talk about in creative writing classes, and I don't know if you guys talk about this in your classes, is there's so many voices in the room. You just kind of have to train yourself to hear the voices that are understanding what you are trying to do and listen to those. And other people, it's good to know what they think, but you don't necessarily take that advice. There was someone, I was workshopping part of Noah's Wife at one point, and it's 40 chapters because it's, Noah's Ark. And a guy in the class said, I think if you stopped at 37 or went to 42, it would be fine. I don't know why you need to stick to 40. And I was like, well, 40 days and it's a motif, And he was like, also, I don't like that you never name Noah's wife, so for the rest of this conversation, I'm just going to call her Betty. And I was like, okay, that's
wow.
You do you.
Yeah.
But, so that was not helpful. But I also think that writing even a novel which feels like it's by yourself is a really collaborative process. And I'm listening to conversations around me, and parts of them are coming in, and I'm remembering things from books I've read, and part of that is coming in. And so if other voices are coming in the editing phase, that's okay too. And I've gotten better at letting go. In part because if I were just going to write something for just myself, the perfect way I wanted it, probably no one else would want to read it. So I can just do that in a diary, and then I'm okay changing a little for the world. By world, I mean, it's not world famous or anything.
Yes.
For readers. It's coming with the movie.
You have no idea who's reading it right now.
No.
Isn't
That's
that
true.
fun?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead.
I was gonna say, well, that's kind of what I was gonna ask is, well, why did you write it? Was it for readers or for enjoyment or for yourself? How does that kind of shape your work and your motivations and everything?
Yeah. question. The first one, I think I wrote more for myself. This one, I think I wrote more with readers in mind, which is, I learned more about audience, which is both a good and a bad thing. Because then, I don't know. It's a challenging relationship between the writer and the reader. And I think, there's a line I was saying to Daniel in his memoir where he's talking about art making, and you'll remember it better than I do, but he says something about one of the things the speaker has learned, I'll say the speaker, is that the joy in making art is in the process itself and not in, it doesn't really matter what the final thing turns out to be, there's just such joy in doing it. And I've been thinking about that lately. After the novel came out, things have been kind of busy and I've been moving around a lot and I have not been writing every day. And I feel a little bit adrift and a little bit unhappy. And there is such joy in kind of sitting with your latte before anyone else is awake and just like watching the sentences kind of fall into place and that sort of meditative thing. And I think as we're just so focused on, I have become so focused on product and output. And I'm trying really hard to get back to something that feels more genuine and feels more like it's about the process regardless of what comes out of it.
And I definitely believe that, but at the same time, you can't, I can't escape the idea that there's a life cycle of a story or a book, and if it doesn't achieve its final stage, which is in publication, then it doesn't exist in its full-blooded form that it needs to. I do believe wholeheartedly that all my greatest joy comes from writing, and publishing is the worst part of the whole process, and it's not fun at all, and yet that's what you're writing toward. You're not writing for publication, but you're writing toward it. That is where you want your work to end up, and yet that's the least valuable experience of the whole thing. So, but I wouldn't want to write a book and say, all right, I've done that, I've gotten, squeezed that sponge and that stone or whatever, and now I'm going to write another book and I'll just throw this book away. Just could never do that.
And the nice thing about publication is, it allows you to have that conversation. I'm always kind of writing for the imaginary reader, and then it's so nice to then be with a real reader who's like, why did you do this? What happened? I felt this. At my launch in Minneapolis, just invited everyone I knew in Minneapolis. But there was one person there I didn't know, and I thought she wandered in by mistake. But I said hi, and she said, I read.
Wandered in by mistake.
Yeah. There was drinks, and we were chatting. It was great. And she said, I read this short story of yours, and it really moved me, and so I wanted to come to this. I was like, oh my gosh.
That's awesome.
I have a fan,
That's
a fan that I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh right, I wrote something that moved someone, and we get to talk a little bit about it. And I just think, we all know we're in this kind of loneliness moment and epidemic of isolation and screens and everything. And so if literature is still a way to connect, which I believe it is, then it's worth doing.
Well, I think this has been awesome.
Yeah, great. Thank you for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Let's give her a hand. Not that you wrote this to get applause.
No, but it doesn't.